Okay, let's dive right in. We're looking at what can only be described as a geopolitical earthquake. And it didn't play out in some, far-flung war zone. This happened in the North Atlantic, an area the U.S. has for decades seen as its own backyard, its secure naval highway. And the sources we've gathered are very clear on one thing. This was a live operation,
Hmm.
not a drill, not a warning shot. This was real.
It was absolutely real, and you have to see it for what it was, a strategic masterstroke. It wasn't just a military skirmish. This was a very loud, very public announcement of a global power shift. We're talking about a major U.S. Navy warship, a modern one.
An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer based on the reports.
That's right, one of their most advanced ships. And it's suddenly surrounded with incredible precision by Chinese warships and submarines.
The surrounding itself is just staggering. But then you get to the definitive moment, the thing that no one could ignore. Our reports say the ship was boarded.
By a commando unit, yes.
They took physical control, and then the most visceral act of symbolism imaginable. The U.S. flag comes down, and the Chinese flag goes up.
Sudden, precise, and fully prepared. That's the quote from the source material, that flag replacement.
Yeah,
That was the entire point.
exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to get past that initial shock. We need to unpack the fault lines this event just ripped open.
Yeah.
Why now? What was the real reaction in Washington? And how did this just completely fracture the global alliances we all took for granted?
Well, you can't overstate the psychological impact. For the U.S. Navy, that ship wasn't just a piece of hardware. It was a floating symbol of American power, of being the most powerful Navy in the world. And the humiliation, which you can see in the internal reports, it was profound. They just couldn't process this kind of tactical defeat.
And that humiliation, that shock, it seems to have translated directly into, well, chaos in Washington. The sources describe emergency meetings from the Pentagon right up to the White House Situation Room. And the word that keeps coming up isn't anger, it's panic, even fright.
Mm.
But I have to ask on that. Was the panic real, or was that more the media narrative spinning up? Weren't some reports suggesting the White House was just playing it cool to avoid, a massive escalation?
That's a really important distinction to make. Look, the White House posture might have been a strategic pause. That's what they said publicly. But the operational panic at the Pentagon, that was 100% real. The Defense Ministry had to come out and admit it. This was an undeniable failure of intelligence, a failure of readiness.
In their own backyard.
In an area they thought was totally secure, you can't spin that as anything other than fright. Your most basic security assumptions have just been shattered.
They got hit where they felt safest.
Mm.
And that failure is intelligence. It very quickly became a failure of resolve. It just cemented that the U.S. was on the back foot.
Absolutely. And the order that came next was, I think, the most telling strategic retreat of the modern era. The Pentagon told the rest of the U.S. fleet in the area to go home, to retreat to their bases.
Oh.
This wasn't a tactical repositioning. This was them abandoning the field. They were there to project strength, and instead, they just left.
So they confirmed to the world that Beijing was now calling the shots.
It confirmed the initiative had completely shifted, yes.
Which brings us to the question that must have been echoing through the White House. Why? Why would China make such a huge, direct military gamble thousands of miles from home in what's historically been NATO's lake?
Well, if you look at China's stated reasons, the picture they paint is one of strategic encirclement. It was an accumulation of pressure points that Beijing finally decided it couldn't tolerate anymore. They saw what the U.S. was doing not just as, economic competition, but as a deliberate attempt to strangle their global ambitions.
It was coming from all sides, right? This wasn't just about ships in the ocean.
Not at all. It was the compounding effect of everything. You have the ongoing tariff war, the tech bans.
Especially on semiconductors.
Yes, the crippling restrictions on high-end chips. Then you have the pressure on rare earth mineral supplies. China saw all of that, combined with this new, massive U.S. military buildup in the North Atlantic, as a clear and present danger.
So they saw it as an attempt to cut their supply lines.
To cut their supply lines and pressure the maritime routes they need to reach markets in Europe and, importantly, India.
Okay, so help me connect those dots. Tariffs and semiconductors on one hand, and the captured warship in the Atlantic on the other. What was the specific worry?
It's about securing future trade. The Pacific is already a contested space. They were worried about their ability to access the Atlantic, either through the Suez or maybe even through future Arctic routes. The heavy U.S. naval presence near those key choke points was seen in Beijing as a move to be able to turn off the tap.
To cut off their trade with Europe.
Exactly. And that military buildup was the final straw. It's what turned their economic anxiety into a very concrete military action.
So China drew a red line. And their message was, brutally simple. If you keep squeezing us economically and militarily, we're not just going to send a diplomatic note.
No. The response will be military, and it will be where you least expect it. They showed they were ready to answer in kind on the open sea. And in doing so, they basically ended the era where America could treat the North Atlantic like its own private property.
But they were careful to frame it, right?
Right.
Not as an act of war.
Very careful. They called it a reminder of America's limits. The point was to break the psychological hold the U.S. has had for decades. That control, which was based mostly on the fear of what the U.S. military could do, has now been broken.
And now they have the ultimate piece of leverage, a captured American warship.
And an ultimatum to go with it. The sources say it's non-negotiable. The ship isn't going anywhere until the U.S. pulls back its aggressive deployment and drops the tariffs and the military threats.
So what does that mean for the global economy? Because China also warned this was, quote, just the beginning.
It's a huge threat. They signaled a pivot. They're moving away from a general trade war to targeting very specific U.S. supply lines that depend on Asia.
Like what? What are we talking about?
Think about critical components for pharmaceuticals, key inputs for high-end electronics and manufacturing. They're threatening to hit the U.S. economy right where it's most vulnerable.
Okay, so let's pivot to the alliances. Because as soon as this happened, the global map it seemed to redraw itself in real time. Russia, first of all, immediately and fully backed China.
Yes, and that just solidified this new reality overnight. Russia's statement was unambiguous. Any U.S. counterattack on China would be seen as an act of war against Russia.
That is a massive deterrent.
It's a deterrent Washington simply cannot ignore.
And they backed it up with military moves, didn't they? It wasn't just talk.
Oh, absolutely. The Russian Northern Fleet went on high alert immediately. And then you saw a big increase in submarine movements coming down from the Arctic into the North Atlantic. The signal could not be clearer. This is now contested territory. It is no longer a secure NATO lake. The strategic calculus for the U.S. just got infinitely more complex.
So while the big rivals are closing ranks, you see these huge visible cracks appearing inside the Western Alliance.
Yes.
Inside NATO. France and Germany in particular seemed to step back immediately.
They did. They called for restraint, for dialogue, and they stated quite clearly that they would not support any military action that would escalate this. And that, historically, is a massive shift. For decades, NATO members would more or less rubber stamp major U.S. military decisions.
At this time.
Not this time. This shows a deep reluctance to get pulled into a confrontation with China, especially one that could wreck their own economies.
And what the sources make clear is that this hesitation wasn't just about economics. There was recent history at play. Something about Greenland.
You have to look at that detail. It's a critical psychological piece. That earlier incident, when the U.S. administration seemed to question Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland, it created enormous anti-U.S. sentiment.
Right. It wasn't just about an island. It felt like the U.S. was treating its allies' territory like it was for sale.
Exactly. And that memory, that feeling that U.S. leadership was unreliable and disrespectful was still very fresh. It made European leaders put their own national interests first, instead of just automatically falling in line.
So the U.S. basically walked into this crisis with an alliance that was already frayed because of its own actions. Okay, so in the middle of all this chaos, India emerges as I guess the unlikely but undeniable Kingmaker.
India's initial response was a masterpiece of strategic neutrality. They kept their distance, but they issued this very sharp statement. They blamed the U.S.'s aggressive policies for the whole situation.
So they essentially said Washington brought this on itself.
They did. They opposed any unilateral military pressure.
And this is where the story gets really incredible. Because just 48 hours before this, the U.S. was the one putting pressure on New Delhi. Threats, even.
And then suddenly, the U.S. officially asks India to step in and mediate.
Wow, what a reversal.
A complete reversal. They need India to pressure China to release the ship, and maybe even more importantly, to help the U.S. save face on the world stage. The switch from threats to begging for help. It's a stunning indictment of the policies that led them to this point.
So what does India do with all this newfound leverage?
Well, they're using their unique position, being in BRICS but also having strong ties with the West. They're signaling that the old rules are over. Any future relationship has to be on the basis of equality and respect. No more threats.
And they're not rushing it.
They are not. They are focused on securing their own long-term national interests. And meanwhile, the whole U.S. strategy of trying to split India from Russia,
It's in tatters.
it has completely collapsed. In fact, Russia is now actively strengthening its energy ties with India. The shift is complete. Every path forward now goes through New Delhi.
Okay, let's talk about the immediate fallout, the real-world consequences. Economically, the hit was instantaneous, and it was global.
It was. You saw massive volatility in the markets. Oil prices spiked.
And marine insurance rates, I saw, went through the roof.
They did, especially for those key Atlantic and Asian trade routes. And of course, tech stocks got hammered, especially any company that relies on those complex Asian supply chains. It reflects this deep fear among investors that the whole global supply chain system we've relied on for 30 years could just break.
Which, paradoxically, probably makes India look even more important now.
It absolutely does. Investors are now desperate for a stable, large-scale alternative to China. And this event just accelerated that entire trend.
Meanwhile, back in Washington, the political infighting is just intense.
Oh, yeah.
Congress is openly at war with itself, and the media is pointing the finger directly at the White House, blaming the president's aggressive and chaotic policies.
And the main criticism seems to be that the administration just opened up too many fronts at once. They were picking fights with China, Russia, India, Iran, even Europe, all at the same time.
Fretting their resources too thin.
Exactly. And that created the strategic vacuum that Beijing just brilliantly exploited.
I think when you take a step back, what this crisis really did was it just made the new reality undeniable.
Yeah.
The world is not unipolar anymore. It's just not.
It's not. The U.S. is no longer the sole superpower, and China just proved it's ready and willing to challenge the U.S. militarily on a grand scale, far from its own shores. The era of global control that was based on fear of American military power, it's over. The U.S. is learning a hard lesson here, that real strength in this new world is about cooperation. It's about strategic patience, not just raw force.
So the captured ship wasn't really the main event.
Not at all. It was the symbol of a much bigger psychological and strategic defeat, the defeat of decades of unchallenged American dominance. The power structure has visibly changed.
So this crisis really forces a choice on Washington. You either escalate into a multi-front war, you probably can't win, or you start negotiating a new multipolar world order. And we're already seeing the first move, that sudden change in language toward India, from threats and tariffs to
Friendship and partnership.
Exactly.
So the question this leaves for you, the listener, is this. What does India do now? Will it really use this incredible leverage to shape a new set of global rules, to insist on a different way of doing things? Or will it just play the traditional role of mediator, helping the U.S. save face? What new terms, what non-negotiable rules will New Delhi demand for this next era of global stability now that it's clear every critical path forward runs straight through India?